Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to allow some further people to log in. So we'll kick off in a couple of minutes.
Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Welcome to this IMP information session on incorporating stakeholders' voice into impact measurement and management practice. Thank you all so much for joining us for this session, which is part of a short series we're doing to update folks on emerging practices in impact measurement and management. If you're new to this series, welcome. If you're an old friend of the IMP, welcome back. We will be sending these slides out after the session, but if you need them now, Jo has just pasted her email address into the chat, so please do let us know, as we will be screen sharing this whole time. So in brief, this session is going to give an overview around what stakeholder feedback means, why it matters, why it's become such an emerging topic amongst standard setters in the impact and ESG measurement and management space. And then we're going to hear a few examples from my colleague Jeremy on how to do this in practice. And of course, we'll reserve a good amount of time at the end for questions from you all. So please start thinking as we go and do paste your questions into the chat box at any moment. So who are we? My name is Olivia Prentice. I am COO and Head of Content at the IMP. Jeremy, would you like to say hi?
I'm Jeremy Nichols. I'm an advisor to IMP on all things impact accounting, and I'm a founder and non-executive director of Social Value International.
And Jo?
Hi, I'm Jo. I'm the engagement lead at the Impact Management Project.
And Jo has been organising these sessions for us, so you can see at the bottom of the screen there just a few more informational pieces about these sessions. We always share recordings of these after the date, but please do get in touch with her if you'd like any more information, or as I say, if you'd like to see those slides before they're circulated. So we're going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes now talking through some content, and then we will turn to questions after that. Just to reiterate, for those who've just joined, please do paste your questions, type your questions into the question and answer box within the Zoom platform as we go, and Jo will do her best to collate them all at the end. So just briefly, for those that aren't familiar with the IMP, we wanted to just clarify a few pieces of terminology before we kick off. We will be using this definition of impact at the top of your screen here. This is a working definition that has been as being agreed and considered amongst a lot of the leading standard setters in this space through the core work that the IMP now does, which is the IMP structured network, where we come together to facilitate greater harmonization around definitions and approaches to impact measurement and management. So when we talk about impact throughout this, we'll be referring to changes in outcomes caused by organizations, where an outcome is an aspect of social, environmental, or economic well-being. For those of you not familiar with that definition, I would encourage you to look at the OECD work on well-being. So why is this important? Well, the focus on impact is based on the logic that once you are measuring changes in outcomes caused by an organization, you need to figure out whether that is positive or negative, whether that impact is positive or negative. And so you need to do that in context of a social or ecological threshold. So that might be a living wage, and wage data, the change in outcome being the change in wage status over time, or it might be something like the change in white blood cell count versus threshold for what a good range of white blood cell counts look like. So there's an example. And so that matters because if you're looking at that change in outcome over time in context of a threshold, that information is then usable to reduce the bad stuff that's happening and increase the good. And that's what we will refer to throughout this presentation as impact management. And we'll have a real focus in today's session on that decision-making piece. Once you collect the data, what happens next? So I'll now turn over to Jeremy, who will give us a little context on why this conversation is so important and so timely.
Thank you, Olivia. So let's jump straight to the next slide. A bit of context is the big picture for all this, I think, and this is also an opportunity to just kind of get a feel for where you're thinking. Inequality, as this represents, has been increasing globally, certainly in wealth, and there are some arguments around income inequality, but if we just think about wealth inequality, the last figures from Oxfam were top 1% of the world owns 52% of the wealth. So I just wanted to ask you to just use the show your hand button in the participant box. If you think that inequality is going to reduce, should we say get better, over the next 5 years. Let's have a quick show of hands for any of you who think it's all going to be fine in the next 5 years. And we'll take a no show of hands of it isn't going to be fine at all. And I'll just leave that for a second, and then perhaps, Joe, you can give us a quick sense of the results of that. Any hands showing, basically.
There's none showing at all, and there's 70 people on the call.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so that's most of one sense or another. Our work relates to the types of challenges around impact that are going to, we hope, reduce inequality, and that is an important driver of our work. Yet we don't tend to think that actually we're going to be successful in shifting the needle, and that's a bit of a scary reflection. And the context, I think, for stakeholder involvement is going to be within that. So if we just go to the next slide, just think a bit wider that in terms of the global response to that challenge and the related ones around the climate. Are the SDGs, which I'm sure we all know. And one of the SDGs have specifically got inequality in them as number 10, but also have a considerable number around environment. And in the other Oxfam statistic, the top 10% of the richest people are responsible for 50% of the carbon effect. So at both ends of the inequality spectrum is very related to the achievement of these goals. The achievement of these goals is getting ever harder given the rate at which we're facing those challenges, and operates within an existing financial system in which there's a very high level of accountability built into the investor for what value is being created. And against that backdrop, we are trying to create a world where impact is happening at a rate that's fast enough to offset those negative trends and reverse them. And that's a big challenge. And it's a particularly big challenge where we simply don't have the same level of being held to account by the people who are experiencing impact as exists within the financial ecosystem. And it's that sense of what it would look like if we were held to account that we're striving for when we start to think about stakeholder involvement, not as a consultation process, but as an active involvement in which there is a higher level of accountability than we currently face. So that's the doom and gloom bit, and we're going to move into we can solve that, we can be positive. We're going to have a quick poll just to kind of, I think, get a sense from you as to what we're all doing at the moment and whether we think we're all actively engaged in this and to the extent. So let's just quickly launch that poll. So yeah, tick wherever you get to on that. I'm not sure we can respond to more than one of those answers. Is it multiple choice?
Yeah, it's multiple choice.
So any of those, the more of those that you do, the better. If we could just quickly flick through that, and then we will have a quick summary back of where we all think we are at the moment, ranging from, I mean, obviously this is the assumption that we're doing something in here, but we're thinking about impact in terms of that definition that Olivia started with around well-being, all the way through to they're all actively involved in decision making, and we're telling them what we're up to. We'll just give that a few seconds really, because it's not necessary that we all immediately do that. Don't worry too much, but we just want to get a quick sense. How many have we got in, Joe? We can't see the results creeping in. So.
We have 60% have voted so far, so maybe just another 20 seconds to anybody else.
I'm going to sit here and wait till everyone's responded here.
Yeah, no pressure, everyone.
And I would say if you're an investor thinking about this, do also think about this from your own organizational perspective, as an organization with customers and with employees of your own, even if it feels like a very broad question to ask about your investees. Just our way of saying no one should have an excuse not to be able to answer the question.
I think we've pretty much got as much.
Yeah, run for it. Let's see what that looks like.
I'll close the poll now. And you should be able to see the results.
Right. That's very encouraging. In fact, our job is done. No, that's great to see. And so we'll try and reflect on those results as we go through the presentation and trying to put some context around that, because it's clear that a lot of you are already actively doing a lot in this space already. And we're going to be trying to, therefore, I think, tease and test and push the boundaries of that in the context of that wider global challenge. Okay, thank you. Let's crack on. Now, before we go, I suppose, too far into what's happening out there and what's available, we just need to have a little bit of conversation around what we mean by feedback, because it can mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts. And this is not exclusive, but it's the main ones which we're going to be thinking about. So we can have different types of information coming to us from those stakeholders. And by stakeholder, we mean all those people or planet or that are affected by the work that we're doing. And we're talking about whether information is subjective or objective, where subjective is the kind of things that you couldn't actually go and check if you wanted to. So it's people expressing a sense of their feelings or their perceptions. You can't actually go and check, but nonetheless is very useful and very insightful. You can add to that or alternate that with objective data, which is whether or not you would actually go and objectively do it. You could go and check. So, you know, I was offered a job, we could check whether that was actually the case, even if we didn't. We substituted kerosene lantern for the solar lamp, we could check that. And then we can have information that's not self-reported, so it comes from another source. So that is a third party collecting that. Again, we could check it, but it's not come from the person actually experiencing the impact. And we're not saying these are, a priori, any of these are better or worse than each other. They can be used in conjunction with each other to improve the rigor of your work, but they're the different types of feedback that we're going to be talking about. Now, I think it's also true that we all recognize that we should be doing something on this. There's a kind of gut sense that stakeholder involvement is a good thing. What we want to do is increase the usefulness of that. There are a growing number of the standards out there thinking about these issues, and pretty much all of them require or suggest or mandate some form of involvement of stakeholders. ranging from the involvement to meaningful engagement. There's slightly different languages in all of these. Most of you, I'm sure, would have come across one or more of these, but this is not uncommon. So the problem is that that's all fine, but what is that actually going to look like in reality? And just to add to those, actually, and we're going to come back to the question when we get to the case study around the issue of assurance of information, the International Accounting and Auditing Standards Board current kind of consultation guidance on the assurance of impact information also refers to the benefits and needs of involving stakeholders. So, you know, even in the kind of mainstream audit world, this is becoming a recognized good thing. How? So we're going to move to how, and then we're going to come on to focusing on why. So we'll just do a little bit of the how first. So keep going. We're going to use as a reference point for this the work of the Capitals Coalition and their protocols in terms of the steps that they set out. We find those to be a useful sequence of events. There's inevitably going to be some kind of process behind all this, and we're going to be thinking about how stakeholder involvement is not at any one particular point, but is useful throughout that cycle. It starts with the issues about where are we going, what is our goal, what is the scope of what we're going to be thinking about impact of, and then a process of determining what those impacts and dependencies are. And involving stakeholders is really fundamental to understanding what those impacts are. We can also use the process of getting people to report who they think those other stakeholders are. It's often a good way of checking that you haven't missed anybody out, because there's no harm in that. But the real fundamental issue here is if you really want to understand what are the impacts that you're having on people and the planet, then pretty good idea to find out from the people who are experiencing them what they think. That's obviously slightly harder for the planet, but we're going to have to use a voice to act on their behalf. It's also useful if you want to use third-party research that you can check whether, to the extent to which that is relevant to your context, by supporting that with self-reported data from your stakeholders. Once we know what it is that we're talking about, we can then move into steps 5 and 6 to measure what the drivers are and the dependencies that underpin the impact that we're going to have, and then to measure the actual changes in what the Capitals Coalition referred to as the capitals, whether that's natural capital, social and human, where the language we would be using is changes in the outcomes experienced. It's the same thing really, but we will then be getting data from the people experiencing that in order to know how much change has happened. That, I think you're probably all doing that and know about that. Certainly those first two, perhaps slightly less common at the moment, although growing, is this question of valuing the impacts and or the dependencies, which is the understanding of the relative value in order to help us inform the decisions that we're going to be making. And I think it's important to recognize that we are making decisions. We will be allocating resources to one activity or another. And in doing that, whether or not we have information about the impacts and the changes in those outcomes, we are valuing one of those options more highly than the other. And the task here is to involve stakeholders in understanding that value from their perception to help us make a better decision. Of course, this information, particularly from those who are looking at it from outside an enterprise's perspective, is only one source of data that you will be using, and other data can be brought in. It'll enhance, develop, refine what's going on. And again, it is possible still to go back to stakeholders in that context. And finally, once we take action, it's a pretty good idea to tell people what's changing, why it's changing, and the extent to which their involvement has informed that change. So we're going to be kind of thinking about, to one lesser extent to another, how we involve stakeholders throughout that cycle and those different steps. First up, then, is this question of how do we find out what the impacts actually are? Now, you can do all of these at very different levels of rigor. You can do these on the back of an envelope all the way through to spending considerable amounts of time and resources. And it's very important that we're clear about what level of rigor we need for whatever our purpose is. What are we going to do with this information when we've got it? If it's designed to inform decisions, then we need to be clear, or the decision maker needs to be comfortable that the information that they're being asked to use is good enough for that decision. And we talk about enough precision for the decision. So the first how could be quite a simple exercise, but much of the work that you'll see around that is often either some form of focus group or some form of one-to-one survey where you are asking very open-ended questions. The more open-ended, the better, in order to understand the perception of those people who are either have been affected or you expect to be affected, what they think is going to happen, what outcomes are, and how they think they will change. That is a qualitative research approach. And again, you can, as they do that as an informal focus group, you can be super rigorous in how you get that data and interpret it. But at some way, you're taking stories from people about their experiences and coalescing them into what you think the outcomes are that relate to their well-being, with them coming to some starting point for what it is that are the outcomes that you are then going to go on and measure and so manage. The next chunk then, I think, is probably the more common bit that you see, is where you are then probably surveying information from people using some kind of either online version, paper-based has gone out of fashion, phone call-based. Increasingly, there are a wide number of apps, and a large number of those are much more cost-effective at getting to large numbers of people with short numbers of questions. And we'll come on to some of the examples and resources that are available to do that. We did some work, I think it was about a year ago, is that now right, Olivia? About 12 months ago, with a number of other organizations, 60 Decibels, Keystone Accountability and Social Value International, to come up with some guidance on using self-reported data. And if you go to that, you'll find examples of the questions. I think it's important not to kind of jump in and just repeat those, because you need to reflect on the kind of language and the context that you're operating in when you're developing that. And if you are using whatever the route is that you're using to collect that information, the risk of, if there are too many questions, people you don't get any results. It is important. And then, sorry, you can then go to any of these organizations' more specific guidance, which is consistent and very comparable with the collated version, if you want, that we pulled together. There's a lot out there. I think one thing that is often, particularly in the circumstances that we're operating, is that we can spend a huge amount of time worrying about getting a representative sample of the people we want to get data from, on the basis that we do not have the time or resources or even the possibility to get data from everybody. So we go, well, we better get a representative sample in order that our sample can be used to make statements about the total population. And you start thinking about statistical issues in terms of the variance of that, or standard deviation and so on. And I think we need to be very careful when we do that, because for most of us, whether or not we send out or survey a representative sample of people, it is very, very rare that everybody responds. And as soon as your response rate goes below and you don't get everybody back, you no longer have a representative sample, and it becomes very, very difficult for you to make statistically valid statements. Not impossible, but the kind of resources that are required goes up. So immediately at a practical level, I think it's much more about recognizing the risks and biases within the data than it is about expecting or hoping to achieve that kind of level of perfection. These things become barriers to our ability to use the data for decisions. The last three of these areas are perhaps the ones that are less considered. Come back at us if you don't agree, but this issue is about thinking about relative value. The issue is about broadening the data and the verification of that. Let's use the word verification or assurance, and the feedback loops with stakeholders to keep them on board. So in the case study that we're going to look at, we will try and shift the focus a little bit more to those, whilst covering the first two as well. So I want to look at the case study of an organization that's called the FRC Group. This is a social enterprise. It's based in Liverpool. Although it is a social enterprise, it is very much a commercial organization in what it does. I am a non-executive director, and so kind of live and breathe what's going on in the organization, and I chair the social value subcommittee within it. And FRC has won numerous social value or social impact awards for its reporting. I think last year, to the extent that one of them gave us a special award and said, don't apply for the social impact award anymore. So that was good, we thought. So we thought we're quite proud of ourselves in our reporting. This is a business that grew from, I love that photo. It doesn't look like 1988. It looks like 1950 or something like that, but it is only 88. Very much a charitable operation when it started. Very small number of people, got furniture from people and gave it to people who needed it. Today, turnover is going to go over 10 million this year. It's all contract income. So I'll come to the kind of sources of that income, but it's earned income in a very competitive market. I suspect that our margins are around 1%, and we have to compete with, all other private sector suppliers in winning that work. We have around 50 staff, which include 15 or so trainees. So about a third of that, I suppose, is then people who are long-term unemployed, who are with us for about a year, and then we expect them to go on and move on to jobs somewhere else. This is obviously quite a bizarre competitive model, because we are working then with people who do not have the skills, and as soon as they do have the skills, we lose them, whilst at the same time competing with other businesses. In terms of the group's activities, on the next slide, there are three main areas of work. There are contract income from local authorities for doing bulky household waste. So if you want to throw away something that's big, we will come along and pick it up. We will bring that back, strip it down into small pieces. Some of that actually goes to landfill still, which we try and minimize. So there's an environmental impact there. Some of it is sold as its constituent parts. Some of it is fine, and we resell it for a furniture store. So what we promote is selling pre-loved furniture, in effect, at a lower price than the competition. The Furniture Resource Centre is a furnished housing service. So if you are a housing association or a care home or any organisation which needs to be fitted out with furniture, FRC will turn up and fit that out, from the curtains, the white goods, the carpets, the whole thing. That, there are a couple of other bits, but that's the main core of the business. Based in Liverpool, but still has branches up in Newcastle. Until recently, we had a branch in London, but recently closed that. The last bit of that was that we have shifted to campaigning, and I want to come back to that, around furniture poverty. I'll come back to the amount of, we don't spend a huge amount of resource on that at the moment, but it has become a significant part of our strategy, if you want. In terms of how we do stakeholder involvement, sorry, thank you. I think it's all very well in theory, but when you get into the reality of running a business and trying to do this in the context of a fast-moving environment where you have constrained resources, there's lots going on, it's a very competitive market, we're very pragmatic. What we want this to be very useful. We're not aspiring for perfection, as you'll see. Some of it is quite formal and structured. Some of it is pretty informal. Across the different business lines, it varies, and the different steps that we outlined, it varies, but there's something in there. We do think it is fundamental. It is part of helping us identify both risks and opportunities to what we do, and has driven some of those changes that we're going to come back to. Some people take an approach to involving stakeholders and ensuring the accountability is there by bringing them into governance, and we have not done that. There are a number of challenges of bringing people and asking them to represent other people in their situation into a governance structure, which we can come back to, but at the moment we have chosen not to do that. But the whole process and systems that we have in place are nonetheless designed to try and address that gap in accountability, because we do recognize that the people whose lives we're having the most positive effects on have very little ability to actually hold us to account directly. You know, they are often not customers, they're not investors in a sense, they cannot turn up at the board meetings, they do not sack the CEO. So we're trying to build that back in, because we do believe that is a fundamental way of enhancing and improving our performance. And part of that is then to be transparent. And you can go to our website and you will be able to download both many years reports on our social impact And also you can have a look at our materiality and stakeholder engagement policy, which a quick summary of not all of it, but just the headline kind of idea of it's on the next slide. So this is just taken from that document that you can see. It just basically lists the stakeholders. It talks about how we relate to them, what kind of things they're interested in. We think about whether the issues matter by 2 screens of whether it's relevant and significant. And then we talk about how we are engaging with them and what the routes are for reporting on the impact that we're having with them. And for the eagle-eyed within you, I have spotted the March 2015 typo. So yes, we'll be needing to update the website and correct that. So yes, please go and have a look at that. And we would be also interested in any thoughts and comments and feedback you have on that. So yes, definitely. I'm going to take you through then some of the areas of business and or activities and quickly give you a sense of what we've done around this. But the bit that I'm really interested in from my perspective as a director is what we do with it. And that last step, which was take action. If we're not taking action as a result of this involvement, it really begs the question, why are we doing it? It does take time and effort. And the test for us of whether that time and effort is worthwhile is effectively the action that we're taking on the back of it. So we do train people and we hope that leads to employment and that they leave us and get employment. And when we were thinking about what the outcomes are that they experience, we did that around small focus group, which we refresh informally, but initially was fairly formal. And we then carry on collecting information from people after they have left us. So once they're off and in a job on 6 monthly cycle for 2 years, we do think about the relative value of that employment. We think about it in terms of the value to the people, and we think about a wider value to society in more general, which is shorthand for other stakeholder groups and is therefore a simplification. And we think about that in order that we can compare that with the other activities that we're doing. And we did that using pretty much secondary research combined with the level of income that people were achieving. So we weren't doing primary research on that. Now you can quickly get a sense of potentially that these are not super rigorous. And so why does that become important? Well, the starter ones of those were that it allowed us to target our services more effectively dependent on the characteristics of those stakeholders. So simply by looking at the type of people that we're working with and identifying relationships between the outcomes that they experience and some of those characteristics, we were able to give better and different types of support, specifically to people who are more isolated, as opposed to people who are living within families when they come to us on that route. You pick up the fact from the focus group that there are negative outcomes and that not all good. And it's very easy to forget those. And so we have done a little bit more around doing work with people who don't get a job or whose experience of jobs is not so positive. Now, on the not getting a job, it shifted us towards running after work job clubs and continuing to stay in touch with people and feeding them job opportunities even afterwards, which may sound obvious that we should have been doing that, but we hadn't been originally doing it. More importantly, this conversation from the focus group work said and made us realize that whilst we were very successful at getting people into jobs, they weren't great jobs. And particularly as there's been a growth in zero-hour contracts, and a more competitive environment, the jobs that people have been going to have been less good over time. And this was one of the primary drivers for us of having to completely rethink our approach to how we supported people. And we no longer think about helping people get into a job. Our strategy is now to help them progress from that first job to a second job, preferably a supervisory role. And we are now equipping them with, or aiming to equip them with the skills to make that transition. And this is an early stage in this strategy because the timescale for that outcome to now happen has gone from when they leave us to get a job, from when they actually go and get that second job. So that is, could be a year, could be 2 years. It's given us, if you want a bit of a headache on the managing the information to know whether we're getting there. But irrespective of that challenge, we felt it was really important that we responded to this issue that people were saying, these jobs aren't great, we want better ones, by recognizing we needed to have a longer term strategy. Alongside that, we used to run placements. We used to have people coming in for short-term placements. And again, we had focus group activity around them. We got the information from surveys. We used the same type of secondary research to assess the value of that. I should have said in your note from the top that we do state those values in monetary equivalents, financial proxies. We use financial proxies to be able to help us make comparisons with the cost, the money that we're spending on them, and also the conversations we have when we're having these arguments at board. These placements were positive. They had positive impacts on people, and people liked them, the staff liked them. But it kept coming back to us that the amount of value we were creating for the resources we were spending was simply nothing like as high as if we put the money into something else, specifically the training. And so it took us a while to actually grapple with that, but in the end we stopped it. And we put the money somewhere else, which I think is maybe a rare thing to do, and it was a hard thing to do. On the waste collection, we use secondary research. These are environmental outcomes, and so it's a bit harder to do that. We're talking about avoiding landfill. We're talking about the carbon impact. We use secondary research, and we rely on the operating data to assess how much. And for reasons that I'll come back to, one of the specific examples of a change was that we converted our logistics fleet, because in many ways this is a logistics business, at the time to diesel, although looking back now, you wouldn't do that. We did at the time because it was far more efficient from the perspective of carbon, even if not other emissions, as it turns out. Perhaps the more interesting ones are around the links between the furniture sales and the furnished housing, where we have been running one-to-one interviews mainly with people who are in the store and or customers who are in furnished housing. We have relatively small numbers of surveys on that. The interesting bit that we've been grappling with is what's come out of those surveys is a sense of people saying that the furniture they have contributes to their sense of being in a home. And that really is the outcome, that they have a home. And we have been working, and we're only just on the edge of getting this research out, but we've been working on two things. Firstly, in focus groups to work out what the outcomes that are relating to that, of which there are around 10, but also then on what is the relative importance of those outcomes and what is the relative importance of the different items of furniture in contributing to someone's home. Those focus group conversations brought us to about 10 items of furniture, and we are now waiting excitedly for the results. And we kind of hope that the results, I suppose, suggest that in those 10, there's some kind of clustering, that there will be some which are much more valuable than others, and that would inform our decision-making in terms of prioritizing which bits of furniture we get to people first, when and where. Of course, it is also possible that research will show us that there is no specific difference between how valuable those items of furniture are, or that the variability in the results is more challenging for us in terms of using that information to direct our resources. And this is a constant theme. You never get the kind of perfect data that you'd like to see in theory. At some point, whatever you do is going to sit in front of you, and you're going to have to weigh up the pros and cons of the biases within that and the risks within it in making decisions. However, and probably a bit in advance of the data, which is another challenge, we have nonetheless moved from what was a furniture charity to what was an employment, a support business in many ways, using our businesses really to help people, to changing that around to think that actually what we are about is providing homes, and that this is probably the most significant value, watch this space, and that at the moment is what has driven us into realizing that by ourselves, we're not going to have a significant impact, and that we need to broaden our effect. And part of that is resulted in the need to shift our business strategy towards the provision of homes and to align that with a campaign to actually get more systemic change. And that has been influenced by a number of factors, but one of the key ones has been this feedback from people talking about how important that sense of having a home is in relation to many of the businesses that we were running. So that is a quick kind of whiz through the practical realities and the important bit about what we're doing with that. Next slide, please. The internal management of that, just quickly, is that we have a social the social accounting and the financial accounting work streams both report to the finance director, so that we have all that in one place. And actually, we found the accountants to be very good at doing the social accounting, surprisingly maybe, but they've moved from being nervous about it to loving it. We have a finance subcommittee, like many businesses. We set up a social values subcommittee because getting the decision makers comfortable with the information arising from that kind of stakeholder involvement of varied quality really needed both executive and directors to be learning how to do that and being comfortable with it. And those subcommittees set the budgets, which give us the annual overall budget, so that we can assess both our financial and our social performance. But one of the critical pieces of this is increasingly, and only over the last year, I would say, become this extent to which we are actually responding to that data, responding to stakeholders, and can say something more than thank you for your data, but what we did. And we're now, early days in this really, but we're now reporting to the board on the number of changes made across the organization based on impact data. So the managers have to bring that information to us, and we have a very rough taxonomy at the moment of whether they're small, medium, or large changes, and we haven't made any large ones yet. The external reporting is about, has always been, an inclusion of our financial accounts as per with some kind of social value report. Over the last few years, we have actually fully integrated those. So what would traditionally be the director's report is now the social and environmental impact report as well. We change the name every year depending on what's the flavor of the month. But both of those are in one document, and both of them are audited. Now, of course, we have the financial accounts audited, but we also have the social impact information audited. And we use two standards for that. And one of the important ones within that on the next slide is Accountability's 100 assurance standard. And that's built on their principles. And one of those you'll see is this principle of responsiveness. And to be fair, we have been, we've had qualified reports because we've done all right on some things and not on others. And we've always been happy to go public with those qualifications. But in the management letter, ironically, perhaps, we've also been critiqued for our lack of stakeholder involvement and the fact that we haven't been doing enough. And that when we've been doing it, we haven't been responding. So we've had to raise our game, and the assurance conversation has been really useful in helping us do that. I think it's given us a kick. And it is as part of that, where last year we were seen to do very well on responsiveness, that we realized that we had no systemic approach to it. We could tell you anecdotes and there were stories about how we had responded. But if we were really going to manage our performance, we needed to systemize that. And that is why we have brought that in recently as a new metric for managing our performance. Next, and then finally, I think, is that this is an ongoing journey for us. One of the reasons I absolutely love being involved in this organization is a sense of we're not there yet. We do win awards, and we do think we're not bad in terms of doing this in practical ways, which we actually use. But, data rigor is a problem. There are definitely challenges when you're not sure about statistical relevance and the variances around them for how useful the data is. We still and consistently have a problem about the contribution effect when we start to say, well, how much of the outcome is caused by us? We rely on a mixture of stakeholder perception and secondary data sources, which the evaluators amongst you will, I'm sure, tell us is not very rigorous. It's still useful in providing us with insights, but it remains a challenge to get kind of regularly updated context-specific information on our contribution, and does then, I think, restrict the boundaries of the kind of choices that we might be able to make. It is difficult following up with people, and if we're now saying we're following up with people for several years afterwards, staying in touch, asking them to respond, particularly those people who have not had a positive result, is a problem. And we don't throw our arms up with that. We go, well, we'll do the best we can. It's a constant tension. I think we would, as a board members, would push for more, and the executive would worry about whether that would be effective. We do incentivize it so that those returns that we do get go in a hat, and they're the winner, and people get money. And so we're quite happy to make sure we find ways of encouraging that to happen. The big issue remains this journey that we're on is what is good enough, what is high enough. We think that by pushing our budgeting thinking around this, that we are setting targets which are achievable, but have some tension in them, aspirational. in order that the board is acting on behalf of the people whose lives we purport to have an impact on or represent in some way, given that they're not there themselves. We are increasingly recognizing that these conversations need us to have a broader scope and think about more about systemic change. And that has shifted our strategy completely. So it's not just that we're making minor operational changes, we have had big systems, strategy changes. That involves working with other partners, and that's time consuming and difficult. And we're still there, we're now sitting there thinking as a board, thinking, well, to some extent, we've been driving a business model that has been reasonably profitable in challenging times, and on the back of that has allowed us to do things which have had a good impact. What would that be if we turned that around and said, well, the impact's what's really important. How do we devise business models that support a much higher level of impact? And that is where we are still at and still thinking. In all that, you will notice that this is all pretty varied, good, bad, indifferent. I would just say, if you've got the right culture and a willingness to do something around this, you will find the ways of how to do it in ways that meet what you are trying to achieve. And it has to come from you. And part of that, just to go back, for example, to the audit question, is that we're currently asking our auditors to do their audit of us as if they were acting on behalf of our stakeholders. Currently, they really act on our behalf as the directors who are employing them, and they report to us. And we want to shift that because we think that will give us a bigger kick than the one we're getting. And that comes from your board culture and the management culture. And if you've got that, I think the rest of it to some extent follows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy and Olivia. I'm going to pause the recording now, which will commence the Q&A.